Good afternoon, Dr. Hicks. How are you doing?
I'm good. How you doing, Justin?
I'm doing well. Thanks for joining us. Can you tell us a
Cool.
little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a professor at the University of Denver. I teach in the communication studies department. My teaching and research focus on argumentation, rhetorical theory, and philosophy of communication. I'm also a long time debate coach. Up until just a couple weeks ago, I was the director of debate at DU, and where I'm transitioning out of that role. But I've been, and I also do a lot of my work on collaboration. I spend a lot of time thinking about community collaboration and public deliberation.
Okay. Where did you study?
I went to graduate school at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. I went there as a master's student, just the idea of being there as a debate coach for a year, and then before
This
I'd go
gets you.
on and do something, and I got sucked into it. I really enjoyed. I started working with a professor named Lenore Langsdorff, and she introduced me to argumentation theory, and it fit really well with what I was doing with debate. And she was also kind of unorthodox in the sense that, a wide berth, so I could take a lot of the ideas I had about argumentation and debate, which really focus. I mean, what I loved about debate was more of the creative aspects of it. I mean, a lot of people. I mean, I love the interaction and the competition, but it was really about what drew me to it was the creativity that I could come up with strategy and position writing, things that could really expand my intellectual universe, run arguments that no one else was thinking about or running. Because the other thing I did in college was I was a photographer. And so my thought would be that I would go, and I'd gotten into film school, and was saving up money for that. Thought I would take a detour and do a year of coaching in order to save that money, and then found that all those ideas about creation and creativity could be incorporated into the intellectual study of argumentation. And so I just stayed around and finished a PhD.
Yeah, I feel like studying and writing, theorizing is a form of art.
It is, absolutely. And one I really enjoyed. I mean, and I still enjoy quite a bit. I mean, everything that I do is really oriented around that value, whether it's my research or my teaching. It's, am I involved in an engagement that is not only fueling my own creative juices, but providing a platform for others to be creative. And I love teaching and research when it does that. And I found argumentation theory to be both a really stable and open community, and really caring and really tolerant of lots of different kinds of ideas, and really novel approaches. So it's a perfect environment.
Yeah. What do you think argumentation as a study offers society?
Well, I mean, in its most basic aspect, it helps us learn how to make better choices and more um, effective decisions. That is, we have to make choices and decisions all of the time. And the wider range of alternatives that we can consider in making choices, the more rigorously we can test the possible consequences of those choices, the better that we can weigh those alternatives against each other, I think the better society we create. And so argumentation teaches us how to do that, both as individuals and in groups. Um, and so for me, it's essential. If not, we would just be making decisions based on pure self-interest, or making decisions based on just what our ideology, tells us is the right answer. And we wouldn't have a method for really diving deeply into all of the possible implications and consequences of our choices. So that's what I tend to think, that argumentation is uniquely suited to that.
That's really interesting. One of the things I want to tease out here is what you initially said is you seem to put in opposition the idea that argumentation is somehow different than just simply seeking out your self-interest, right? Which seems to go against one of the ways that people often position argumentation as as reasoning as motivated self-interest, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I tend to see argument always in relational terms. That is, as when we are engaging in an argument with someone, it is a particular type of relationship. Now, that relationship, if you just confine it to that verbal activity that's happening in that moment, might be seen one as opposition, whether it's a couple fighting and or someone trying to negotiate with a bank over a mortgage or a police officer questioning a suspect. Um, but there's always a relationship that precedes and extends beyond that moment of arguing. And so I tend to think of, and because it's relational, then my orientation is that even if you're trying to maximize your self-interest and you just want to use argument as a club in order to beat down your opposition and prevail, um, you're still doing that within a context of a relationship. And if you extend the time frame of what the consequences of that behavior will be, they tend to come back and erode the very thing that you were trying to achieve. And so uh, yeah, I tend to think of argument not really in its essence as self-interest maximization. I would tend, if you're going to do that, I would suggest that you shut down avenues of argument, right? You try to create unitary decision-making authority. You offer the flimsy of reasons, and you simply do what you want, and without, the concern. But a lot of times, to get what we want, we have to negotiate and compromise, and to deal with others because we need them in order to maximize that interest. We need their agreement. We need their approval in
Can I
order to do that.
So can I pause for a minute just to sort of
Yeah.
translate what I'm hearing you say? Because I think it's really important is that when people argue with each other, it's always within a context. Let's say you're
Hmm.
arguing with your partner.
Hmm.
That's not the last fight you're going to have, no matter
Right.
how much we think it is going to
Right.
be.
Absolutely.
And you want credibility with them moving forward. So you're
Yeah.
not going to just straight lie to them all the time, because if
Right.
you lie to them, you're going to lose future credibility. So you're going
Yeah.
to offer the best reason that you think. And so you're more inclined to also maybe retract a reason if you think it's not good anymore, because you want credibility moving forward when you
Right.
do truly feel like you have the best reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, most of the time, when we're in arguments
Arguments.
with a partner, let's say a romantic partner, um, we're not, again, we tend to think of argument as disagreement,
Yeah.
right? Oh, we have a disagreement and we're going to duke it out. You're going to offer what you think is the right reason. I'm going to offer what I think is the right reason. And we're just going to keep going round and round till one of us accepts that other's reason or just acquiesces and says, okay, I can't fight anymore. I mean, that's a small sliver of argument. But most of the time, what we're doing is trying to make decisions together, right? Are we going to buy a new house? Where are we going to go on vacation? How do we want to parent? What should the nature of our intimate relationship be? Um, and when we're deliberating jointly, we're also offering reasons. Typically we might frame them as reasons, but they're positions that we take relative vis-a-vis each other and vis-a-vis the issue. Um, but what you're really trying to do is produce a reason for us, right? What is a reason that we both can not only accept, but wholly endorse as coming from us and defend as our own reason, right? I mean, one of the surest ways to damage a relationship is to make a joint deliberation with a partner. And let's say you decide, you have some idea about where you want to go on vacation together and you make a decision about that. And then let's say people come over or you go to a party and someone were to say, oh, what are you guys going to do for vacation? And one of the partners I'd say, well, I wanted to do X and Justin wanted to do Y. And we finally compromised. I mean, that's already to position you as independent. and as not a joint couple. And that does long lasting damage to relationships. People usually don't understand that. It's just kind of natural for them to do that. And so you're really so argumentation for most of the time, and when we're in relationships, isn't about the fighting. It's about the coming together and creating a common set of reasons, a common set of preferences, and then using those to guide your joint action. So I've always just been really careful not to think of argumentation primarily as rooted in disagreement or rooted in opposition, because I think that cuts off the vast majority of what we're doing when we're reasoning.
Interesting. So how would you define an argument then?
I mean, I think an argument is it's a good question. I mean, there's, of course, I'm sure you've talked about this with your class, and other people have talked about, we tend to think of arguments either as discrete products, like, oh, I'm going to read this argument in the paper about what we should do about global warming, or arguing as an activity that we do with individuals, and then different perspectives on it, or is it a procedure for managing a dispute? And I think it's all of those. But I mean, I really think, for me, I think arguing is a process of offering claims and propositions to another person to see if they will accept them, to see if they will modify them, to see if they will offer their own, and to craft something in common that you can move forward with. And so, I don't have, just a distinct functional account of an argument, because I think it's an activity that we do. I do think it involves making claims. I do think it involves advancing propositions. And I like those terms because they're relational, rather than an assertion or a reason or evidence, which all already presumes an individual. I'm asserting this. This is the reason I want to do this. This is the evidence I have for my position. And then another individual who's independent, no, I make a claim upon you. I offer you a proposition, which is not just a statement of fact or declarative statement that you think is true, it is hot outside, but a proposition in its full sense of, I'm offering you something. I'm, trying to entice you into doing something with me. And so I think an argument is whenever we're making claims, or whenever we're advancing propositions to another person.
So what would you call this approach to argumentation?
I mean, I tend to call it a process relational approach, focusing argument as a process and focusing it within the context of relationships. Now, it's easiest to think of that in interpersonal terms as the relationship between friends or lovers. But I mean relationship in a much broader sense. I mean, you have a relationship, again, with a banker. Or, I've written a lot on the way stockbrokers and their clients interact, and what should be the standard and the norms guiding that interaction between you and a store clerk, or
can you give us one of those examples?
Boss. Yeah, I mean, so let's say I'm planning for my retirement, and and most of us, work in these large systems like mine's through something called TIIA CREF. And you might meet every once in a while with an investment advisor, or more likely you're going to go through some kind of program in which you're going to enter all your information, and they're going to say, this is how you should distribute risk. Right? I mean, you have to understand that that's a particular claim they're making. Oh, you should invest in this manner to protect and promote your future thriving. And so, what do you do in response to that advice? You can just simply accept that advice. You can modify that advice. You can contest that advice. Hopefully what you're going to do is engage in a prolonged discussion about your own tolerance for risk, what your future needs are, and all of that. I mean, certainly the wealthy have that constantly. Right? The more money you have, the more personal attention you receive, the more tailored it is to what you want. But that's a relationship then, right? Between you and whether it be that actual investment advisor or even the program, which it just loaded in a range of preordained choices that would prefer, shift you to their preferred funding strategy. And so, for me, that's as much of a relationship as friends or as lovers. I think, a police and a suspect is a relationship too. When, again, people are making claims and they're offering propositions to one another. And so I just want to think of the whole range of relationships.
Interesting. So you're using the term argumentation then to start thinking about how different people interact with one another as a proposition, how it draws out the relationship over time.
Right, right. Yeah, a proposition is not really just a statement of truth. It's a lure for feeling, right? It's a lure that we use to entice and to attract. And so I tend to think of arguments as not just being true or false, but attractive or repulsive. That is, what are we drawn to? What are we repulsed from in terms of the proposition that we're offering the other? And then argumentation is that process of, crafting those propositions, negotiating their dimensions, modifying them in terms of what both people in that relationship need or want. Now, of course, there are some relationships where the power balance is so extreme that one of the participants might not has very limited resources for doing any of that. That's like a police and a suspect, right? But they're still there. If we really attend to the entire notion of what they're called speech acts, of what people are doing, even like in George Floyd, right? When he's saying 28 times, "I can't breathe," that's not just a declarative statement. It's called an entreaty. It is, I am telling you something as a demand, an invitation come demand that you respond in kind to me, which would first be the recognition of that person as having the authority to make such a demand, to issue what's called a second personal reason, and then to respond in a way that's alert, alive, and sensitive to that demand. And again, all that's going to be mediated by the structure of authority, but what you saw go on in that incident was a complete indifference to that, George Floyd having the ability to make an entreaty. But it was made, an argument, a proposition, a claim was made, right? Whether or not it was sufficiently taken up, I think is pretty self-evident by the video and by the reaction.
Right. So you're saying that very sort of speech act itself was a form of a proposition because it operated as a lure, but the police officer decided not to take up that lure. And that is something that we can look at through the lens of argumentation to evaluate.
Yeah, if you look at the video, he's acknowledging in his bodily movements that the entreaty has been made, right? And then, in the subsequent actions by, whether he says, "Oh, you must have air in order to make the statement," or, pressing down further. It's a response. So, that itself is an exchange, right? We don't have to limit it only to what is said, right? And the entire bodies are involved in argument. My master's thesis was on kind of relational arguments, and and that's what I heard all over and over from people. Like I have a visceral reaction when I argue. My body, my breathing, my eye, everything's involved in that. And so I've just never believed in restricting all that's really involved in those moments when we're arguing with each other. And so you pay close attention to that. People are responding all the time to you, right? They just might not be something that you could transcribe as a sentence.
No, I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, is that if we look at that interaction and we start using those heuristics, then what normative framework then would this sort of process orientation give us to look at these events?
Yeah. That's what I've spent a lot of time working on, and I tend to use the term reasonableness to describe that. So if you think about the two terms that we often use in argument to evaluate an argument are either whether it's rational or whether it's reasonable. And when we think about the rational, it has two primary meanings. The first and most common definition of the rational is to maximize one's self-interest, right? It's a rational decision. to use this course of action in order to maximize your self-interest. The other is that it's epistemically sound. That is, we're basing it on a thorough review of evidence. We're obeying the standards of informal logic in terms of whether or not that evidence actually supports that assertion. And so you want to be rational is I examine the situation, look at all of the available as evidence, and then I come to the decision that's going to maximize my goals in the most efficient and effective manner. That would be rational, and that's an important standard that we should never lose sight of. When we think about the reasonable, what we're really doing is we're evaluating the relationship between the arguers that is unfolding at the time. You know, we typically think about, is it fair? Right? I go, oh, this is unreasonable. I'm saying, oh, I'm not being treated fairly here. You know, and in particular, the power that you're exercising over me at this particular moment is not in any way fair. I always think of reasonableness as that term we use to assess the interface of power and care. And because those two things are always present, we look at trust, power, commitment, care. Those are, and so we want, you know, and so when we're trying to make a reasonable choice or a reasonable decision, we're considering not just our own goals, but we're considering the needs and goals of others, especially those that we stand in relationship to at that in that particular circumstance. So, you know, you would hope that you could evaluate any argument and or any decision made on the basis of argument as both rational and reasonable. Now, you know, I would also throw a third one in there in terms of possibility, right? You want to not just minimum standards of rationality and reasonableness, but as an argument, create conditions of possibility for novel action, for creative action, for rethinking the very basic assumptions that we walked into, whether that be about that relationship, about the nature of the self, or about the political you know, arrangement that we find ourselves living in. And so I tend to look at those three as standards and focus primarily my attention on what is reasonable.
Interesting. So how would you map that on to the George Floyd example then?
Well, I mean, I think we would begin by asking the question, what is a relationship between a police officer and a citizen supposed to be, right? Are there certain amounts of respect that are due to each party? Are there certain kinds of considerations and care that we expect from each party? What are the lines of authority that each party can exercise vis-a-vis each other? I think then we start asking, you know, we move down from that in terms of thinking about the relationship between this particular officer and this particular suspect, right? And at that point, when the citizen transforms into the suspect is really important to consider, right? And, you know, and are they, and that's why we have all these legal standards of how you make that transition. When do you turn from just and citizen to just and suspect? Right. And when you make that transition in the eyes of the police officer, then what are the corresponding authorities and demands they can make upon you, right? Now they can physically restrain you. And so we start looking at that relationship and what we think its normative qualities ought to be. And then we dial down into the specific behavior. And so you know, when we think about the reasonable in a police shooting, I mean, typically we look at a couple of different things. The predominant thing is to look at feelings. So when Chauvin goes on trial, the focus is going to be, did he have a reasonable fear that his life was in danger? And therefore had to use the force he did in order to protect himself, or a reasonable fear that others' lives were in danger if it wasn't just his own, right? And so we'll focus on that. What is a reasonable fear? What makes fear reasonable or unreasonable? And you can't do that outside of a relational contextual thing. But we're also going to look at his acts, right? What is the amount of force that he applied to George Floyd, and was it proportionate? in response, right, to the threat. I mean, then we have quite really interesting questions. Look, he passed a fake 20 or supposedly passed a fake 20, right? A non-violent crime, but using a force that would usually be proportionate only to a violent crime, right? So I'd start just unpacking all those layers of the encounter, all the way down to a detailed analysis of the transcript. And again, as we were using the example earlier, when Floyd says, "I can't breathe," and that's an entreaty or a proposition that's entered into the discursive space, and into the visceral affective space, how is that responded to? And would look at those, what is that proper relationship between care and power? And again, whether or not we would use the rational, we could look, then we get into questions about, okay, what about Chauvin's perception, right? What was guiding that? Were there implicit biases? Was this based on categorical reasoning rather than individuated reasoning responsive to the situation? And what were the kind of, fallacious heuristics he was using in order to ascertain the level of threat? So I would start unpacking them that way.
That makes a lot of sense. And the way you're articulating that, it seems like it's very granular and detailed based on the context that gave rise to the specific, or that gives rise to the specific encounter, and how that leads to the overall situation in which those two parties interact.
Yeah, that's where it ends. I mean, it begins, though, in much more abstract, universal claims about, again, what's the relationship between a police officer and a citizen? How do you move in from citizen to suspect? I mean, I think those questions have to be asked and answered, not only within the particular situation, but more generally. And it's the fact that we don't have good general guidelines for that. It's a big part of the problem, right? Which is what, should be guiding the interaction from the very beginning, right? Again, go back to the example of friends or lovers, right? Depending on what you think a friend is how you should treat your friends. What you think it means to be in a loving and caring, intimate relationship is how you should treat your lover. And those things precede the beginning of any particular relationship. Most of the time we are just enculturated to those. We're just taught those. We assume them. And we've never really questioned. And then getting back to your earlier question about what's the purpose of argumentation, what good is it to society, is that argumentation is a means for exposing those assumptions and testing and negotiating and transforming those assumptions, which may be at the very heart of a lot of dysfunctional and violent relationships.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's making me question then is like, what sort of basic assumption is underwriting the police when they start changing the way they relate to the community from, serving the community to maybe a militarized police force post 9/11 that feels like they need to be governing or
Yeah. I mean, if you go from a community to a population, and from a population to a set of discrete threats to and within that population, you're going to police very differently than if you think of it as a community, as a neighborhood of people with long-standing ties and relationships to that neighborhood. You're gonna police completely differently, and that's what we've seen.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. I think that's a really interesting way to think about argumentation, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you.
So do you have any closing bits of advice for future upcoming argumentation scholars?
Well, I guess I'd reiterate that to think of, while disagreement is central, it is not the full package. That we use argument to agree as we might use it to disagree. We use it collaboratively as well as oppositionally. I would say remember that arguing is an embodied visceral activity, that for most of it's an incredibly highly emotionally charged encounter. And don't forget about the body, don't forget about the emotions. And third, that you know, if you take those into account, then argumentation can be something that we design, that we create platforms in advance for how these people can interact, that begin with what we want out of a relationship, begin how those relationships structure the kind of society we want. So use those tools in order to design a better way of interacting and therefore a better world.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Hicks, for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye.